So let's start this webinar. Thank you for joining us today. And Antonio will introduce you and the topic. And thank you again for participating to this interesting webinar.
Sure. Thank you, Professor. Before introducing Geoff Tyson, I would like to thank Professor Indolfi and the Italian Society of Cardiology for giving us the opportunity to share the last advances in artificial intelligence in this webinar that we are going to conduct together. So good morning, Geoff. Actually, is evening in Italy, but you are on the other side on Pacific coast of the United States. And just to introduce you, Geoff Tyson works at University of California, San Francisco. He's a cardiologist, and he has recently published a paper on Nature Medicine where an automated ECG analysis is able to demonstrate that a deep neural network is able to exceed, to have better results compared to cardiologists in interpretation of some electrocardiograms around more than 10 different rhythm alterations. And beside this project, Dr. Tyson has recently demonstrated the importance of automated analysis also for echocardiography. And there is also another paper regarding the detection of atrial fibrillation, which is the most diffuse rhythm disturbance in our population. So basically, Geoff graduated in medicine at Johns Hopkins University, and he has a board on internal medicine, and actually is also an expert in engineering. So basically, I don't want to spend additional word. I want to leave the entire field to you. Go ahead, Geoff. Thank you for participating.
Great. Thank you very much for the generous introduction. Please interrupt me if I ever get too soft or if any of the slides go awry. So first off, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks for hosting this webinar. What I'd like to do today is I will focus on the Nature Medicine paper regarding EKGs. I'll try to explain that in some detail. But before I do that, I also would like to give basically a short introduction into machine learning and so-called artificial intelligence methods as well, such that everyone here can hopefully get a bit of an introduction to that, so that when you encounter it in the future, you'll have some idea as to the vocabulary and the basic terms that are being used. Because I think you'll start to see more and more of this as time goes on. So let me make sure I can move my slides. Oops, there we go. Okay, so here are my disclosures. So I'll spend the first third talking about basic terms and concepts in artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'll then move to apply those and discuss those with regard to the Nature Medicine paper. Hopefully that was sent around for everyone to see. And then I'd like to leave time for discussions and questions, as I'm sure some may arise. So starting with some basic concepts and terms as related to artificial intelligence. Almost everywhere we look these days, you can see the term artificial intelligence being used. But what does it really mean? So at the end of the day, when people are talking about artificial intelligence, for the most part, people are talking about algorithms. And by and large, most people are talking about machine learning algorithms. So machine learning is a discipline that is born between the combination of statistics and computer science, where statistics takes a distributional view of data, so it makes assumptions about the distribution. It fits models accordingly based on these assumptions and comes to an answer. Computer science has derived over the years a slightly different approach to solving data problems. It's a much more computational approach, and an example would be to find out how to best split data into two groups. Let's just test every single data point and every single example that we have and find the split. So it can be a very brute force kind of approach. Now, machine learning has been able to take the best of both worlds. So it's taken a little bit from statistics, it's taken a little bit from the computational methods from computer science, and merge that its own discipline. Okay, so the term the term machine learning is really an umbrella term, and it refers to a number of different categories of algorithms. Now, I've listed some of them here. As you can see, some of them include tree-based methods, clustering methods, regression methods, and regression methods are going to be familiar to anyone who's familiar with statistics. There are other categories like dimensionality reduction or neural networks. Now, this list is not exhaustive. Each one of these categories that I've listed has many different specific algorithms. Oh, sorry. Okay, it has many different specific algorithms within the category, and there are actually many other categories beyond this. So machine learning is an umbrella term that refers to a number of different sets of algorithms. Now, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what is generally needed in order to train machine learning algorithms. So in order to train machine learning algorithms, at least within the paradigm of supervised learning, you need two things. The first thing you need is a fairly well-defined task, so a problem that you want to solve. So for example, you can't just say, I want to teach the algorithm how to interpret all EKGs. That's not a well enough defined problem. You have to, for example, say, I want to teach the algorithm how to interpret atrial fibrillation from non-atrial fibrillation, or to identify PVCs versus normal sinus rhythm. So you have to define the task fairly narrowly, and then you need enough training data that has been labeled or annotated for the specific task. So to make this more concrete, as an example, if the goal is to identify atrial fibrillation, we would assemble a large body of EKGs that have atrial fibrillation and that don't have atrial fibrillation, and we would label them or annotate them, in this case manually. A cardiologist or a technician would go through all the EKGs and label them as having atrial fibrillation or non-atrial fibrillation. And I'll pause to say that this is actually the method that was used in the paper that we'll talk about in order to identify each one of these rhythms. So we assembled a large data set with examples of each one of the rhythms and then examples of the control of lacking that rhythm. So as I said, we assemble many different EKGs for AFib versus non-AFib. We would label them accordingly. We would then input that data into an algorithm, and the algorithm would then learn for itself what parts of the EKG tracing, what waveforms, what intervals, etc., what parts of the tracing it thinks are important to separate out the AFib versus non-AFib EKGs. Okay, so this is a fundamental difference from the way in which most computer analysis of EKGs, at least on the commercial systems, is currently built, because those try to replicate the same rules that we as humans use to identify rhythms or identify morphologies. So for example, it may look for the absence of a P wave or irregular R to R intervals, right? And we would program those into the computer and it would look for those specific features. This is a different paradigm where instead of telling the computer what to look for, you just tell the computer examples of the disease versus non-disease, and the computer will try to find for itself how it wants to separate out the data. Okay, so that's one major difference in training machine learning algorithms versus the classic rule-based algorithms that have generally been used in computing. And as I mentioned, this paradigm I just described is specific to supervised learning, which is one large category of training machine learning models. So as I mentioned, machine learning is an umbrella term, and it refers to many different types of algorithms. I don't have time today to talk about every single category, obviously, but I will spend just a few more minutes talking about neural networks, because neural networks are the algorithm category that underlies the term deep learning, and I'm sure most people here have heard of it before. And it is unique because it is very powerful, and it does allow us to analyze data in ways that we previously couldn't. So I'll start by explaining the simplest reduction, the very simplest unit of a neural network. And that is illustrated here with the yellow circle and the blue circles. And this is a single layer, single node neural network. And when it's reduced to this simplest form, those of you who are familiar with statistical analyses, those of you who are familiar with logistic regression, will actually see that this simplest form, the simplest unit of a neural network, actually is similar to logistic regression. So you'll have three inputs, x1, x2, x3, for example, age, gender, and height, just as an example. It is put through a function. In this case, just for the sake of example, we chose a logistic function, which will then give us an output here, specified by h function x. And so in its simplest form, a very simple neural network is very similar to logistic regression. Now, the power of a neural network comes from chaining many of these units together. So this is a slightly more complicated neural network where you have two yellow hidden nodes, layer 1 and layer 3, and you still have three inputs. But as you can see, the interactions that are possible between each one of the inputs and the output become more complex. And A1, A2, and A3 don't have to represent logistic regression. They can represent any number of different functions. And so you can see that this starts to become complex quite quickly. And you're able then to model very complex interactions fairly well. That's what's been shown. And so this is, again, a slightly more complicated neural network. I will say that, modern neural networks that are used these days range from 50 to 100 layers deep. This one that I'm showing here is only 3 layers deep. And so you can see that the complexity of the neural network can grow very large, giving it the ability to model very complex interactions. But at its fundamental unit, the smallest unit, it's very similar to a logistic regression. Now, the term neural network comes from the idea that it was inspired by neurons in the brain, where each layer, for example, in the visual system, receives input from the prior layer, and then therefore each higher layer represents a more abstract, more complex interaction from the input data, okay? And many of you may have seen this picture, which is the hidden layers, the yellow circles from the neural network I showed before, that if this neural network was trained to recognize faces, then you can see that in the earlier layers, like layer 1, it starts to identify very simple features, such as edges, lines in different orientations, or circles, or shades of white and black. In higher layers, you start to get more abstract representations, maybe things like eyes and noses and mouths. And then at the highest layer, you start to get more complex representations like those of the face. So this is just an example of how, by chaining these modules together, you start to get more complex representations of complex data. So that was a very quick crash course into the basics of machine learning and the terms, and a little bit into neural networks. I'll move now to discussion of the paper, and then, as I mentioned, I'll leave some time for questions. So in this paper, the task that we set out for ourselves, you'll remember I said that to train a neural network or to train machine learning, you need to define the task. The task that we set out for ourselves was whether we could use a neural network to identify multiple different rhythms from a single lead EKG. So we partnered with the iRhythm company, who make the Zio patch. I don't know if this is used in Italy, but this is used fairly commonly here. It's a wearable patch, as shown. Oops, sorry. That is worn for 2 weeks, provides single lead data for 14 days. And we partnered with this company in part because they had a very large number of single lead EKGs in their database that we could use, basically. And they were annotated fairly well. So we took the single lead EKG data, we put it into a deep neural network, as I'm showing here, and ultimately tried to identify 12 different rhythm classes. Now, so we had 91,000 EKGs, single lead EKGs from about 53,000 patients. The neural network was a 34-layer deep neural network. And we compared the algorithm performance against a gold standard that was derived by a committee consensus of cardiologists and electrophysiologists. So basically what we did is we had a group of cardiologists and electrophysiologists come together and annotate a test set of EKGs by consensus. So they talked about it and they decided that this was the diagnosis for each part of each EKG. We also, as a method of comparison, had individual cardiologists that weren't part of the committee also provide overreads or annotations for certain EKGs, and I'll describe that more in detail shortly. You can see the 12 different rhythms here: atrial fibrillation, AV block, bigeminy, etc. And this table one, this first part of table one, shows the area under the curve for receiver operator curve analysis that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And you can see here that the overall AUC, the C statistic, is quite high, above 0.97 for most rhythms, except for EAR, ectopic atrial rhythm. The AUC was 0.91. Now, you see the sequence and set differentiation here. I'll describe the difference here for you, for any of you who are wondering. Sequence level, it just refers to different ways in which we labeled the data and therefore tested the algorithm. So sequence level means that at approximately every second of the tracing was given a label, was given a diagnosis. Now, these dots here are not exactly 1 second, but you can help me and pretend that they are. So that, for example, the first green dot, the label would be normal sinus. Second green dot, labels normal sinus, normal sinus, normal sinus, until you get to the PVC. Then you'll get a few sequence labels of PVC, and then back to normal sinus. So basically, every second, there was a diagnosis on the EKG. So that's the sequence level diagnosis. Now, the set level is simply the total unique number of diagnoses across the whole strip. So that's similar to what we get from the GE Muse or Philips automated read. Okay, so that's the difference in sequence versus set. In truth, they didn't make that much of a difference in the performance. The performance is very similar. Now, in the second half of table one, we also describe a metric called the F1 score. And the F1 score is a complementary metric to the AUC that is the harmonic mean between the positive predictive value and the sensitivity. So it's related to the AUC, but slightly different. And one of the benefits of calculating the F1 score is we were able to calculate the F1 score not only for the algorithm, but also for the average cardiologist. So as you may remember, I mentioned, in addition to the gold standard committee consensus, which we used as the gold standard, we also had individual cardiologists, up to 3 of them, annotate each one of the test set EKGs individually. And then we could average their performance, or we could compare their performance against the gold standard, the committee, and we could then compare the average cardiologist against the algorithm. Okay, so that's what the algorithm F1 versus the average cardiologist F1. And again, we're showing sequence versus set here. And as you can see, for any given rhythm, the average cardiologist actually did not do as well by the F1 score compared to the algorithm. And you can see at the very bottom is the weighted average F1 across all the rhythms. Now, this is figure 1 from the paper, and the top panel in A here shows the ROC curves, 3 example ROC curves. The blue line represents the performance of the model. the red crosses are individual cardiologists, the same as I described before, and the green dot is the averaged cardiologist. And you can see that the blue line is closer to perfection, the upper left corner in the ROC curve, than most of the individual cardiologists. You can see that, for example, in class AV block, that there was one cardiologist, one red cross, that seemed to outperform the blue line. It's closer to the left than the blue line. So there are examples of individual cardiologists that do better than the algorithm. But on average, the algorithm did do better than the average cardiologist. Now, the bottom panel are representations of the so-called precision recall curve. Now, this is the curve that is analogous to the F1 score. And so again, it's complementary to the ROC. And similar conclusions here, where you can see that the algorithm tended to do better, closer to the upper right, than the average or individual cardiologists. But similar to before, there are examples such as an AV block where one cardiologist does better than the algorithm. Okay, and now this is from the supplement, and these are the ROC curves for all of the rhythms we looked at, since figure 1 didn't have space to show that. This is table 2, and for table 2, what we did is, again, we tried to provide a comparison of the performance between the average cardiologist versus the deep neural network, the algorithm. And so what we did is we took the average cardiologist sensitivity and specificity, and we fixed the specificity at the cardiologist specificity. Now, humans and cardiologists tend to actually have fairly high specificity, and that's good. So when we say that something is not AFib, it's generally not AFib, for example. Or when we say something is not VT, it tends not to be VT. That's how humans function, which is a good thing. And so specificity tends to be high by human readers. And so what we did is we fixed the specificity at the cardiologist specificity, and now then we show the cardiologist sensitivity at that level, and we also can show the neural network sensitivity fixed at that specificity. And similarly here, you can see that at a fixed specificity, the algorithm tends to have slightly higher sensitivity than the average cardiologist. Now, this is the last figure in the table in the paper, and this is a confusion matrix. And this is the one on the left is the confusion matrix for the neural network. The one on the right is the confusion matrix for the average cardiologist. The intensity of the blue color shows the number of rhythms, the number of EKGs that are in each box. So you can see that the diagonal line represents agreement between the committee consensus, which is on the y-axis, and the prediction, which is on the x-axis. So there's fairly good agreement, but you can see that there's some confusion. For example, some SVT that was labeled by the committee, the gold standard, was confused as being atrial fibrillation, as you can see by this blue box here. Now, if you look at the left and the right panels, which are the algorithm versus the cardiologist, one interesting finding is that the confusion, the rhythms that were confused with each other, actually seem to be similar between the algorithm and the average cardiologist. So it seemed to be that the algorithm seems to replicate some of the human confusion, some of the human mistakes that were found in the labeling problem, which is a fairly interesting finding. So here are some acknowledgments. I would be nothing without my collaborators and mentors. And I guess since we have about 5 minutes left, I would love to take any questions or continue the discussion.
Thank you. And first of all, many congratulations for a very exciting field. So I have a question for you.
Sure.
As you know, everyone is interested in Apple Watch system.
Sure.
So the question is, if we can having digital data from Apple or for analysis, if you can use Apple Watch for some research protocols.
Sure. Yeah. So there was actually another paper that our group published earlier last year, where we took the heart rate measurements from the PPG, the photoplethysmography, the light on the back of the watch, and we're able to diagnose atrial fibrillation. So that's one method of screening potentially that could be done. Of course, the problem there is that to have a very high positive predictive value, you need very, very high specificity, and it's actually very hard to get very high specificity.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the problems that you've seen in the literature and the media is that inevitably there's going to be fairly high false positives. There's going to be, a large number of false alarms, which is arguable as to whether that's necessarily good or bad, ultimately, depending on the treatment.
So the question is whether or not you can extract data from Apple Watch to do some research, independent research.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think one of the benefits of the Apple Watch is simply the penetration in the population and the of Apple Watch. And so, for example, this algorithm that we demonstrated in the paper could be quite easily used on EKGs derived from the Apple Watch, I believe. That should be tested, but because it's derived from the wrist as opposed to the chest. But I think most likely with some small tweaking, it can be applied to EKGs from the Apple Watch, and so we could start to improve the algorithm based on that data and extract that data for research. So certainly that's possible.
Okay, Antonio.
Congratulations, Geoff. I have a question regarding the additional diagnostic tools in cardiology as opposed to EKG. Do you envision that in the future we will use artificial intelligence just for diagnostic EKGs or for additional techniques such as echocardiography or angiography?
Yeah. Well, I will say that I think it's going to be used across the board for multiple different data sources. Our group here is working on each one of those, both echocardiography as well as angiography right now. But I think actually that the most powerful use of machine learning methods, artificial intelligence methods, will come not only from the individual data sources, so EKGs, angiography, echocardiography, but actually in deriving insights from the combination of the data sources. So, and in addition, from longitudinal repeated data from, for example, the electronic health record, combining that with some of these objective findings on EKG or echocardiography. I think that is where the future will sort of have the greatest impact with AI and medical data. And we're trying our best to work on some of these things. Go ahead.
Hi, Geoff. Congratulations for your tremendous work. It's really an important steps ahead. I have a question. Let's see the matter the other way around. So once we have a tool that allows to recognize a certain paradigm. So let's take neural networks for example, a specific arrhythmias, okay, like atrial fibrillation. So the big question would be, how do you envision to apply this to a broader case of monitoring patients or even individuals? So healthy individuals, for example. So as one of the hurdles maybe is the difficulty to have an invariant picture of what we are looking for, of the pattern we are going to recognize. So did you have some experience with your or similar algorithms applied to a broader context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you know, at the final analysis, the question of what do you do once you diagnose someone or predict someone having a disease with high probability hasn't been changed, meaning that we need to bring them into clinic, we need to get them to take prophylactic medication depending on the disease, so that doesn't change. But I think one of the things that tools like this gives us the ability to do is to begin to make sense of the large volumes of data that are coming in from new devices like the Apple Watch, etc. So, for example, you may have already had some patients come to you to say, "Oh, look, doc, I have 3 months worth of EKG data for you. I brought them all here just for you. Can you review them for me?" And most cardiologists are not going to have time to look through 3 months worth of Apple Watch EKG data for every single one of their patients. It's just not humanly possible. And so I think algorithms like this can help us to separate the noise from the signal and get through large volumes of data more quickly. I'll mention that another work that we've done is using PPG data, so data from the photoplethysmography on the back of a watch or a fitness tracker, and we're able to show. We presented this at ACC. We were able to show that we can discriminate folks who have diabetes from non-diabetes. Number one, and number two, we are able to show that the performance of the algorithm actually improves the more measurements someone has, up to a point, up to about 5 to 10 measurements, right? And so again, I think, you know, these algorithms can tend to do better in some cases with the more data that exists, especially if there's a high noise in the acquisition. And so, you know, that is another use case, meaning that we can start to make sense of repeated data from wearable devices and look at trends over time in ways that we couldn't before.
So last question, Geoff. Do you have any data on detecting ischemia using ECG ischemia?
Yeah. So there was actually some other work. There might be a number of different work from other authors, but I know of one group, and they're actually here at UCSF, and they published a paper also using deep neural networks to look at ST changes. And I think that was from telemetry data. So certainly, I mean, these models can be trained to look at ST changes, and I've done so. It's unpublished, but I also have done similar things. It's simply a matter, as I described to you in the beginning, of having the right data set of examples of ischemia, non-ischemia, and then training the model for that.
Of course, the question is that one read is not enough to detect regional ischemia. So Apple Watch could be not effective since it's detecting one single read.
A single lead?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, yeah, I think like in the diabetes example that I mentioned, there is an inflection point where you go from having not enough data to having sort of optimal amounts of data. I would controversially suggest that maybe there is a point with the algorithm analysis where we don't actually necessarily need 12 leads. Maybe we could, maybe that inflection point exists lower than 12, higher than 1, but lower than 12, maybe. And so that's something to investigate. Does that make sense? So I would agree that perhaps with one lead we can't get everything, but maybe we need 3 or 6 and that's enough.
Yes.
Maybe we don't need 12.
Yeah, 3 is enough, but 1 is definitely not enough.
Sure. Yeah.
To me. Okay. Other questions?
Yes, Geoff, you hit a very interesting issue. So you meant the relevance of having the proper database. So what is your vision of what the business model should be with similar algorithms? I mean, we are shifting from a model where the ones who are leading the market are those who have the instruments or the software or the algorithm. But it looks now that the ones who are holding the power are those who have data, or let's say proper data sets. So, and this is usually in the hands of major companies like Apple or Samsung or Microsoft. So what is your vision to rule this potential market?
Yeah, you know, I think it is true. Well, so a couple things. I mean, I think that to move the field forward, we're going to have to try to collaborate, right? I mean, almost every large healthcare institution has approximately 1 million EKGs in their database, because since EKGs were digitized and saved approximately in 1990 or 95 or something, then you know, depending on the volume of the institution, but most institutions have about 1 million EKGs. Now, if every institution collaborated together, we could easily hit 100 million EKGs, right? In a database. But if all the data sits individually, we're going to have a harder time doing that. So I think ultimately, collaboration between institutions is going to be very important. And in truth, that is more than Apple or Google, at least as far as I know, currently have access to. So there's strength in the individual healthcare institutions if we combine. Number two, we don't just need data. We actually need properly labeled data. And in medicine, that actually can be the bottleneck. That can be the difficulty, because in order to properly label data for most problems, because medicine is so specialized, we often need a doctor or a nurse or someone with specialized training to go back and label the data. And to do that at thousands of scale is very hard. And in fact, this is one of the major limitations of doing AI at large scale in medicine.
But what if Google will try, let's say, starting tomorrow, to use unsupervised learning on data derived from wearables, for example? That's a huge source of data.
Yeah. Well, so you're touching on another area, because as I mentioned, the paradigm I described is for supervised learning. Doing unsupervised learning, I mean, unsupervised learning is an area of a lot of research. The tasks that we're currently using to solve with unsupervised learning are different from those with supervised learning. And so, again, I think right now, a lot of the low-hanging fruit for medical applications probably lies in applying supervised learning, and that requires labeled data. But we could certainly begin to explore, associations found with unsupervised learning, but that'll solve different problems. Sorry, I guess I'm not entirely answering your question. You asked about business model. Well, I mean, I agree. I think those people who hold the data do have a lot of power. But I guess partly what I'm saying is that it's not as simple as simply owning a lot of data, especially in medicine.
So thank you, Geoff. AI is definitely an interesting new field in cardiology, and we are waiting for you in Rome at our meeting in December. We would like to invite you at our meeting in December, and we will be in touch with you for details. So thank you again for this terrific presentation.
You're welcome. Great. I'm honored. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.